evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Alphabetical Fugazi, the only podcast that devotes an episode each to discussing every song in the band's catalog, from Fuga A to Fuga Z. I'm your host, Ian James Wright, and joining me today to discuss By You from 1995's Red Medicine is a music journalist who has written for The Village Voice, Paste, Pop Matters, and was the managing editor at Coke Machine Glow, Corey Beasley. Corey, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for having me, man. It's very cool.
I'd like to know about where it all began for you as a fan of Fugazi, and I'm sure therein lies a tale of how that intertwined with your life as a music writer. What's up?
Good question. So I grew up in central Southern Virginia in a town called Lynchburg, which is pretty conservative as it sounds. But that also meant that I was about 3 hours south of D.C. So I was born in 85, so, I was kind of coming up and coming into my own musical tastes in the late 90s. And I was, coming off of getting into pop punk like Green Day and Blink-182 when I was 12 or 13. And moving from there into sort of more complex music and kind of tracing musical history backwards and to see where sort of punk rock started. So I would spend a lot of time on the nascent internet, on allmusic.com and Napster and whatnot, kind of tracing influences and downloading MP3s and kind of mapping out different genres and such. And so Fugazi kept being mentioned as a touchstone for a lot of different bands that I liked. And for instance, the Saddle Creek band Cursive, I was into them.
Right.
Had a kind of a post-hardcore guitar sound, and they name-checked Fugazi in one song, so I thought, okay, I'll check it out. And I was immediately very gripped by the music. I remember going to the mall and buying Repeater, and when that was still a thing you did. And immediately being very just kind of feeling like, this is what I've been looking for. And then I sort of dove into the band's discography and the band's history and sort of mythos, right? And for me, it was very much an affirmation of sort of who I felt I was as an individual. I was a very progressive person or a leftist person. I mean, I still am, but, coming up around the politics around 2000, with Bush stealing an election and the drama there sort of coming into a political consciousness in that era was pretty fraught, and also coming from a fairly conservative town. So, I felt myself sort of standing apart from many of the people in my town. Of course, Fugazi kind of embodied this very radical, independent do-it-yourself spirit with a certain kind of leftist politics attached to it. So that was very appealing. And I was also a straight edge kid before I knew what straight edge was. I kind of heard the term. I got into Minor Threat after Fugazi, for instance. And so I kind of figured out, this is what, Ian MacKaye was talking about in the song. It happens to fit my lifestyle. And again, felt very affirming. And I think that I came to the kind of straight edge thing and the sort of leftist politics thing from a place of earnestness. And Fugazi, I think, is nothing if not a very earnest band. Sometimes I think they're pegged as, overly earnest, but I do want to talk about that later with this track. But
sure.
So to me, it was like, here's a band that I can project my personality onto. And here's also a band that seems to me to be pretty unimpeachably cool. No one can really mess with Fugazi. No one can really criticize them, I thought. And everyone who knows punk rock or even knows independent music will respect this band, and therefore, if they're my favorite band.
That's very true. There are certain bands out there I've noticed that, people might disagree on whether they actually like them, but there seems to be just a common acceptance that this band is cool. So Sonic Youth, the Talking Heads.
Sonic Youth,
you can take it or leave it, but it's just a fact that they're cool. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is a cool band. Right, exactly. And, I think you get some contrarian people who just sort of point to the band as being kind of, politically boring. But that's more about their reputation, outside of their music, I think. And so growing up with Fugazi, then into high school, I got to see the band when I think I must have been 15, when it's one of their Fort Reno shows in DC, which they used to do pretty much every summer, a free show, and saw them there in the time between End Hits and The Argument. And that was kind of a, life-changing experience as a young person. I'd been kind of someone who had memorized the Instrument DVD and sort of had all my favorite live sets from them to watch that way. And to see them live was awesome. And then when The Argument came out, it sort of just solidified my love of the band. And then I went to college in the DC area, so I kind of got to see Q and Not You and some other Discord bands, and it sort of extended that. You'd see Ian around at the Black Cat. Yeah, and so it just became something that was very, intertwined in my life in many ways, and with living in DC for about 10 years too. So we're my favorite band when I was a kid, and are still my favorite band.
That's great. And so when did you start trying your hand at music journalism?
I started writing a blog, I guess probably now, maybe 10 years ago or so, and used that as kind of a portfolio to apply to write for Pop Matters, which is, at the time was a very kind of content generating site, for better or for worse. Didn't pay their writers, but would let you take on reviewing assignments and profiles, and was really a place for me to kind of come into my own as a music writer. And then I launched into writing for the Village Voice, and I moved to New York several years ago before they sadly shuttered. And Coke Machine Glow, where I was a managing editor for the last few years of that site's existence, was always my favorite website to read. I remember sort of you'd read Coke Machine Glow and you'd read Pitchfork, and they were sort of coming up together as like this kind of smarmy, voice-driven music critical community. And of course, Pitchfork became what it is now. And Coke Machine Glow, we sort of stayed quite small. And as soon as I was accepted to the staff there, I felt I'd kind of reached my goal as a music writer. And so when Coke Machine folded in 2015, I kind of gave up the music crit biz. And I can't say I miss it too much, but it was good while it lasted. Yeah.
I worked on the high school newspaper, and I was the guy who did the music reviews. And I cringe to think back on it now, because I did some absolutely awful writing and made some terrible calls and had some awful takes.
Dude,
but
same. And my stuff is still up there on the internet too, so anybody can Google me and laugh at me. So
mercifully, I think I was doing my writing like enough pre-internet that it never made it online.
It's too bad.
So let's hope it stays that way, because I disavow it all.
It's interesting to think of like a young writer, before having had more space to kind of come into your own voice without the kind of permanent record of the internet. It's just kind of a different time now. So
I often think that about adolescents in general. Like even if you're not doing any writing, who these kids growing up with all their dumb things uploaded in video form to the internet.
What a nightmare.
It's going to be terrible. We're going to have some interesting people with interesting skeletons in their closets running for president in like 20 years or so, I'm sure.
Yeah. I'm looking at you, Pete Buttigieg. But yeah.
But also, just to mention, I'm going to put this in the show notes. You sent me a piece you wrote for Consequence of Sound a few years ago.
Oh, right, yeah.
After old Donald J. Trump was elected. And I that resonated with me, because what you say in the article, it's similar to, I think, why I started this podcast. It wasn't directly in response to Trump being elected, but I'm sure that played a role in why I found myself thinking more and more about Fugazi, just as almost as a way to meditate on that and something to counterbalance these terrible forces at work in the world right now. So I definitely feel you on that article. Readers, check out the show notes, and I'll put a link there.
Yeah, thanks very much.
So today, Corey, we are talking about our first Joe Lally-led song.
That's right.
One of only 3 in the catalog, starting with this album, Red Medicine. the band's last 3 albums all have one Joe song on them, which is nice. I sort of makes me think of him as like the George Harrison of Fugazi in that way.
He kind of is, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, temperamentally too, yeah.
So yeah, let's hear it for Joseph Francis Lally, one of my favorite bass players. I just want to use this opportunity to, since I'm pumping him up, tell my short Joe Lally story, which is I was in a band recording at Silver Sonia, which is it's kind of a studio. It's hard to explain, but basically it like shares space with Inner Ear, and it's like they sort of use part of that as Silver Sonia Studios. So I was recording there, and at the same time, Joe was recording his second solo album, I believe, and Ian Mackay was producing or engineering it. So both of those guys were in the building, and we were just sort of like hanging out in the lobby, chatting. Wow. At one point, Joe was like, he was doing a track, and he was like, "Oh, I need a bass sound that's different from what I have now." So he actually asked to borrow one of my basses to use just to get that different sound. I was like, you can imagine. I was like, by all means, Mr. Lally, here you go.
Sure, yeah.
I remember it was a 5-string bass, and I remember Ian being like, "What the fuck is this? Like, someone to get the wire cutters." So a good time was had by all. So yeah, I was really starstruck.
That's awesome.
I got my picture taken with him, so maybe I'll upload that too with this podcast episode.
Please do.
So yeah,
my Joe Lally story is I went to see him play a set in Charlottesville, Virginia, after Fugazi had kind of gone on hiatus, and I saw him coming in carrying his gear, and I was so flustered that I didn't hold the door for him. He had to get the door by himself. So that's my Joe Lally story. Permanent regret, Joe, if you ever hear this. I'm so sorry.
I'm sure he remembers that and dwells on it to this day.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. Keeps him up at night. Yeah,
that bastard.
That guy, man. Come on.
So yeah, the song we're talking about is "By You," which is of course a song about the Louisiana wetlands. Little humor there.
Folks.
No, seriously though, it does make me think of, whenever this song comes to mind, it makes me think of the now defunct Washington D.C. music venue called the Bayou.
Right.
Do you remember that one?
I do. From my earlier days, kind of going to shows as a young college student.
Yes. That's actually the first time I went into D.C. proper from the Virginia suburbs to see a show. I remember my parents drove me. I was probably like, I don't know, 15, 16, something like that. It was the band Two Skinny Jays. Remember them?
Sure.
Yeah. It was a great show. I had a fantastic time. It was kind of a weird venue. It was like under the freeway. I think it was on K Street, but like way sort of west under, and it was like under the freeway in a weird way. So that venue closed in 1999. Occasionally I wonder if this song is like a sly reference to that venue, but I'm always like, no way. It's just something funny to think about. So
you never know.
Yeah. So Corey, let me kick it to you. To what angle do you want to start with for "By You"?
Sure. Good question. So I guess I want to talk first about the way I think the song is both, in some ways it's an outlier in the Fugazi catalog, and in some ways it fits into a larger pattern in their music, I think. And you pointed out to begin with, the obvious way it's an outlier is that Joe sings the song, one of 3 that he sings. And I don't know how you feel about his voice, but I find that it brings a certain kind of calmness is a weird way to put it, but a certain kind of gentleness to a track that might otherwise have had a more dissonant vocal, right, with the Inner Gee singing.
Sure.
So he's kind of a prettier singer, purely, I guess. And I think that it's then interesting to think about how the other way that I think the song is an outlier, which is that it's really noisy, right? Like even for Fugazi, you started off the podcast with talking about 23 beats off, right? And I think that's probably the only rival in the Fugazi catalog for noisiest track, other than "By You."
Absolutely, it's a real track of contrasts. Joe has this subdued, sort of low-key voice contrasting with an extremely noisy and abrasive song. Two very interesting effects, yeah. Red Medicine was my first Fugazi album.
Right on.
I mean, it made me fall in love with the band, so I guess there's something to that, but in some ways it's sort of a weird album to start with. And the album really blew my mind sonically between the opening noise of Do You Like Me, which is like this crazy confrontational way to start an album, and this song. So I still think of that beginning of Do You Like Me and of Bayou as sort of like defining signposts of the album. I wouldn't say it's my favorite part, but it's something that it really encapsulates the larger feel of the album to me. Just this crazy, noise that they were doing. It's just perfect. This one in particular is like perfect piss off your parents music,
That's very true. As I did, listening to it very loudly in the basement, actually.
And probably piss off your dog also at the end.
Yeah, at the end, right. How could you do this? Yeah. You're right. It kind of, Red Medicine was my favorite record of theirs, actually, when I was listening to them when they were still together. I don't know that I'd say it's my favorite now, but it does have a certain quality to it, right? Like it is sort of a strange record for them, but then on the one hand, it's very poppy. On the other hand, it's quite noisy and strange. You sort of get a full Fugazi spectrum there that I really appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just downright catchy things. There's weird experimentation. It's a good sampler platter for Fugazi.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it, like an appetizer. Yeah. I do think that the way that Bayou fits into sort of a larger pattern in Fugazi's work is we can kind of talk about the lyrics. I mean, they're pretty strange, even for Fugazi lyrics, but it seems to me to be at least somewhat about taking issue with Gen X, right? Generation fuck you, which is something that I think the band also explores in a song like Target, sort of hating the sound of guitars, as Guy says, and, taking issue with these young punk bands who are making a lot of money, maybe. And to me, that, going back to that kind of sense of earnestness I was talking about at the top of the show, Gen X is not known for their embrace of earnestness, right? It's sort of a more ironic sensibility, and that in a way seems like the opposite of Fugazi's ethos, right? They don't, if Fugazi is an ultimately earnest band, then I can see why they would take issue with irony, like Ian talks about that or sings about that in Facet Squared in that famous line. Irony is a refuge of the educated.
Right.
And I kind of see Bayou as exploring similar themes that way, which for me, like I said, earlier, is what made the band so appealing to me in the first place, is that they are, standing for something pretty unimpeachably cool, and not afraid to kind of make that known, I guess, if that makes sense. So
that's very interesting that you think this song has its sights set on Gen X. I sort of read the whole thing a different way. So I just kind of want to, before I say what I think, like, do you want to speak on that a little more? Your interpretation of like how some of the lyrics fit into that interpretation?
I think the first line, that the generation line is the main thrust there for me, because I think after that the song becomes, to me, I guess, almost it seems to be about submission, sort of being sort of ground into submission, almost to the point of suicide, where I've always taken, the note left in your hand is by you as a suicide letter.
Interesting.
And I kind of see the rest of the song being kind of a narrative in a way about struggle, hand over hand over hand. Maybe you're climbing a ladder or pulling at a rope. So some general impressions there for me. It's a very imagistic track, even for Fugazi. I think it can be one of these songs you look at lyrics and you think, what's going on?
Yeah,
but
definitely.
I'd be very curious to hear what you think. Yeah, what's your take?
Well, my best stab at it was, I thought this was more of like an anti-boomer song. Where, so the general idea being, almost as an answer to My Generation by The Who.
Yeah.
Boomers were, at least, I mean, in popular imagination, sort of the like original counterculture generation. With the hippie culture, the Summer of Love, all that stuff.
Sure. Late 60s, yeah.
And yet, as that generation grew up, this is something we're lamenting in pop culture right now. With
and how?
Yeah, they did not turn out to be a generation that really fought for justice. And so you have lines like, you're in control now, right? You're in control, like you don't know. Don't say you're along for the ride. Don't act like...
you're driving.
Yeah. And so, yeah, generation fuck you too. So like that's, when you think of My Generation, that's sort of like a, fuck you song. Why don't you all just, teases that. And I see this song as kind of a 80s punk kids answer to that, right? It's like, we're generation fuck you too. And it's like, I'd say the first little stanza there, define, redefine, you'd make them all the same, but molds they break away. It's almost a feeling as if the boomers assumed that their form of rebellion and their values were just going to be carried forward. Like, we created a revolution. This is how it's going to be from now on. And I mean, clearly looking at what happened with punk in the 80s, that's a huge difference.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's partly that, partly critique of, when these people get into power, they have a chance to really do something, but that's not happening. And I mean, I think that's hugely, we were talking about the Trump administration. It's so relevant now, where
it really is.
We keep seeing these people in positions of power acting like they just have to go along with things, when they could be standing up for what's right. Like, it seems like the best anyone will do is like quietly resign from their position, when they could be making a bigger difference, maybe.
Well, first off, do you mind when we hang up if you will go back and edit it so that I'm the one that's saying that, so that so that is actually my interpretation? I like that a lot. I'm going to change my tune. It makes a lot of sense. You're right. And to define and redefine, breaking mold, sort of breaking out of a kind of conformity, that you might see in the boomer generation post Vietnam. And I think it makes a lot of sense as kind of a reaction to the old guard of activism that sort of petered out and let itself be co-opted into the comfortable lives that boomers live, that people of our generation probably will not be able to live largely. Certainly aren't living right now.
A good line for that is, it feels so good laying down, I won't get up again.
Yeah, man.
Sort of speaks of that to me.
I guess I also, on the other hand, Fugazi was always pretty critical of even people in the sort of punk or independent scene, DIY scene, being showboaters without real sort of activist credentials or doing real work, like in Song Number One or other tracks. So I guess there is that subculture criticism, but I think your broader reading makes a lot of sense to me.
No, I was going to say exactly the same. Fugazi certainly was able to look within their own scene and criticize people.
Absolutely.
Also of note, technically speaking, I just looked this up before we recorded. Generations, the divides between generations are pretty amorphous, and but I mean, if you want to go by the technical definition, Joe Lally is a boomer.
Is a boomer. Oh, say it so.
so it's it's less about that specifically than about to me a sort of person who was once anti-establishment and is now firmly entrenched in the establishment.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's a sort of complacency that, once the boomer generation finally passes the torch, I guess not in this presidential cycle anyway, but once they finally do, then, you could see listening to this song 20 years later and feeling the same way about whatever generation is then kind of in their 50s and 60s and might be sort of more complacent in terms of pushing things forward in a more progressive way. good call to arms. Yeah, right on.
And sadly, although I sort of like this interpretation that I've come up with, the only thing that is troubling me is the title line of that note. The note left in your hand is by
note.
you.
Yeah.
I do not have a solid interpretation on that, so this suicide note is definitely resonates with the language of that line. I can't figure out how exactly it fits in. It's also, of course, there are a couple of ways you could read that, right? The note physically left in your physical hand, but of course, in your hand is sort of a more old-fashioned way of saying your handwriting. So the note, right,
in your hand,
the note in your handwriting is clearly that means it was written by you. It's like evidence that you have done something. It bears all the hallmarks of you having done it. I'm just not sure what that thing is. Maybe just the general political consequences of these people being in power.
Yeah, like you say, I mean, it could be, here we have what you've written in your hand of your former beliefs, right? And then, here we see that you sold them out. I sort of, the suicide letter, it was the passive voice to me. It was the note left in your hand, sort of left there, sort of stillness. But taken into that broader context, I think you're onto something again. You should have a podcast, man.
I want to open, invite people, as I usually do, to chime in on the Facebook page and see if you can help me interpret that.
I'd love to see it.
Certainly, to talk about the music a little more.
Sure.
I had noticed that it's a little bit. There's so much crazy noise going on that it's almost hard to concentrate on what the actual music is. But the underlying riff, I was just thinking, reminds me of Mountain Song by Jane's Addiction, or just Jane's Addiction in general.
Yeah.
It's got that same sort of progression, I suppose.
Yeah, it's got a kind of I think of the song with Joe's bass line, and then when Ian and Guy aren't kind of wiling out, and they're kind of playing a more straight riff, sort of interlocking loops, really, like a kind of Joe's bass line, like you said, kind of just looping around as a kind of calm, sort of repetitive force in this kind of storm of noise, right? But then Ian and Guy sort of doing that rising and falling sliding riff that they do along with the bass line.
Yeah.
And then in the middle of that, you have Joe's voice, which again is kind of a sort of focal point of calm that allows you to kind of find a place within that squall to kind of sit inside of it a bit. And I wonder if that's why he sang the track. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, from what I understand about Fugazi's process, it just sort of they would write the music collaboratively, and then almost sort of when the music was totally completed, somebody would step up and provide lyrics. So, who knows?
Yeah. I do think, the feedback outro for me, one interesting thing I think you see a bit of it in instrument in the video or in the movie where they're recording that outro. You see Guy and his Rickenbacker getting that kind of like a long feedback note. And then it's about an hour in, and then he's talking as the band is recording the track, and he's sort of saying, last time I did this note, it was like, this time you couldn't hear it, it was totally fudged. And so I find it really interesting that even with this kind of noisy, chaotic moment in a Fugazi song, they're still very precise about it, right? Like they're still want to get the precise kind of noisy dissonance that they want, which I think is great.
I was just going to say, this song, more than probably any other Fugazi song, I find myself wondering, like, how many takes did they do?
Yeah, right on.
Because they were so great at feedback, but I mean, controlling feedback is like an imperfect science. It didn't always come together this gloriously, live.
It's true.
Also, if you listen to the very end of the track, there's this like studio noise. It's like someone shouting.
They're shouting, yeah.
It kind of sounds to me like triumph at a great take. Like, holy crap, that was so great.
We did it. Yeah. You can see them do that in instrument too. I think they're yelling. Yeah, Guy's yelling at the instrument there, and I find that that the moment at the end of the track where both guitars' feedback sort of become synchronous.
Oh my God.
It's like very satisfying kind of feedback ASMR, like, oh, what a relief. It's finally kind of syncing up. I really like that a lot.
It's so beautiful in such a strange way, like that. I mean, it's something that you almost would never call beautiful except in that context of this chaos of noise then coming together. And then that perfect singing note. And then that sort of melts into a more like dissonant chord, which also sounds great.
Yeah, it really does.
I remember feeling like, when I first listened to this album, it was so different from things that I had listened to before. I wasn't sure if I liked it. I probably didn't like it at the time. And I remember feeling like it went on forever, like, what is going on? But now listening back to it, it just seems so nice and compact, really. It's like the Stairway to Heaven of feedback noise. Stairway to Heaven solo is what I mean. Like it's well structured. It almost like tells a story.
It has peaks and valleys. I mean, it kind of has an arc to it. Yeah, absolutely.
Are you a musician? Did you ever get into messing around with playing guitars and feedback?
I'm a dilettante. I kind of play a lot of things very poorly, but I guess the instrument I'm best at, my first instrument was bass. So, Joe was always kind of a hero of mine in that way. Someone who could make a bass line that was very hypnotic and rhythmic, obviously, and that seemed quite simple. But then when you go to try to figure out how to play it, you're like, what is he doing? Is he playing a chord here? What's this progression? And Bayou is a little bit like that too. I think he's playing chords, right? But Joe was always my dude. So, but that also means that Ian and Guy in their guitar playing always was sort of mystical to me. I'm like, how could you make any of those noises? I have no idea. You're a guitarist, you said.
Well, I have played more bass in bands than I have guitar. Yeah. So I sort of consider myself to have the soul of a bass player. First and foremost, no matter how much guitar I end up playing. I mean, I did have a guitar back then, and even though I couldn't really play it well, I had this compressor pedal that had it has a sustain knob, so you crank that sustain knob and you can kind of mess around with finding feedback sounds. So this song really inspired me to, I'm sure do more like stuff that pissed off my parents.
That's what punk is for too,
And from like watching Fugazi, I noticed that they would put their the headstocks of their guitars up against the amps to help them do the feedback stuff. So I would do that, just mess
Very
around,
cool.
making terrible sounds in my room. It was good times.
Yeah, man, you're avant-garde. You're sort of before your time.
Yeah, copying Fugazi before it was cool.
I wish it would come back. I wish more people would copy Fugazi
For real
these days.
Well, speaking of which, I was looking around on YouTube for if there were any covers of this. I don't think there are any.
No, I don't think so.
Which, immediately it sort of makes sense. Like, how do you cover this? But, I mean, right. I think when you think about it for a while, I think this one's ripe for opportunity because underneath all this noise, I think there's a really nice melody that could be brought out to the front with a nice cover. Like, if somebody wanted to be creative, dispense with the noise, just really dig into that melody and bring it out. I think it'd be a really great cover version to do. So
at the heart of the song, it's a pretty kind of melodious, gentle riff that you could make something out of. I agree. Yeah, that'd be a cool take.
Get on that, internet.
Yeah, come on, guys. I was before we talked, just kind of going through YouTube and seeing live versions of the track. And there are a few. I know that if you go to the Fugazi Live Series website and search for the track, it's one that they played quite a bit.
Yeah, I looked this up too. It's surprisingly commonly played. It's actually the fourth most commonly played from
Is it really?
From Red Medicine.
From Red Medicine, okay.
Probably, I was theorizing that Joe singing it maybe had a role in that. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Ian and Guy sort of, not to just give him something to do, but to be like, yeah, we need a break. So let's let Joe.
I think I read
this
that. Yeah, I think maybe it was Joe Gross who you had on the podcast too, right? In his book, he was talking about Ian and Guy get to take a break, and Joe can sing a track, and they can breathe a little bit, which makes sense.
I'll have to go back and reread his book and go back and rewatch Instrument, because you do seem to know that thing pretty well. I haven't seen it. I haven't actually watched it in years. I should really.
Oh, you should.
I had a VHS copy, so I have to download it or get a DVD or something. And
yeah. Well, it's they're recording Red Medicine when they're making the movie, so that's kind of most of the studio footage is from this record, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. I went to the old social media to try to solicit a little bit of listener feedback. So Abu Coleman from the Facebook group says he thinks Bayou is almost psychedelic noise, similar to Spacemen 3 or 13th Floor Elevators. Have you listened to those groups?
Spacemen 3, I know. Yeah, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with them, and I looked them up, and immediately I was like, oh, okay, I see it. It seems like they made a couple albums with some pretty different sounds, but some of the stuff I was listening to, I was like, oh, absolutely, I can see this.
Yeah.
13th Floor Elevators, not so much. I think like it's an older.
I don't know them.
Sort of like proto psychedelia kind of band.
Gotcha.
So yeah, interesting stuff. Thanks for that. I'll be diving more into those bands for sure.
Yeah.
Seeing what's up.
I'll check them out as well. I did notice too. I was going back and looking at reviews of the record that came out when it was released, and Bayou was usually called out as one of the highlights, and also it tended to be tagged as kind of psychedelic. So it's interesting hearing that influence. Yeah.
Cool. Well, all right. With all that said, I think it's time to jump into ratings.
Do you like me? Do you like me? Do you like me?
Oh boy.
Yeah. Is this going to be an easy one for you to rate out of from 1 to 5 stars in the context of the Fugazi catalog?
It's tough, It's hard for me to give anything less than 4.5. I'm kind of like, how could I do that? But I'm going to say 4.25.
Ooh.
For Bayou.
I was going to go ahead and give this 4 stars, but I mean, I have not established any rules about the fractionality of stars that we can award.
I'm taking advantage.
I guess I'll probably just stick to whole and half stars for myself. So I'll stick with 4. Like it's not one of my absolute favorites, but it is a song that really defines Fugazi for me, at least part of who Fugazi were as a band.
Absolutely.
It's crucial to their identity. It's a song that probably, if I were watching them live and they started to play this, it would get me particularly excited.
It'd be sick, yeah.
So yeah, those are some of the hallmarks of a 4-star song for me.
It feels important. It feels important to them. I agree.
Yeah. Big ratings for this song.
Yeah, Bayou. Good work, Joe.
Excellent work. So, with that said, let's talk about some plugs. Where can listeners reach you? Do you have anything coming up you want to plug? Any writing you've done recently?
I'm plugless, man. I mean, you can find me at Corey Beasley on Twitter, but I'm usually more over at the CMG Coke Machine Glow account, which is CMG Zine. Anybody want to drop me a line, talk about the band, I'd be just thrilled. I was bored in quarantine recently, of course, here in New York, and I made a Fugazi bracket that I posted on Reddit.
I saw that post.
Yeah, that was me. So I was thinking, okay. I spent a lot of time with seeding the tracks, figuring out what's a 1, what's a 2. So, that's one thing people can do if they're bored on the subreddit and for Fugazi. Otherwise, catch me online, and I appreciate the time, man. It's nice to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. Now that I know that it's you who made that, I might go ahead and put in the effort and do that myself.
Dude.
I don't have a ton of spare time these days, but it did strike me as something fun.
It's a good time.
Whip out some kind of basic photo editing software and I guess do that. Yeah.
Cool, man.
All right. So as for me, you can reach me at fugaziatoz@gmail.com and join the Facebook group, The Alphabetical Fugazi. I'll be posting some more threads about upcoming songs that I'm recording. Try to let you get the chance to chime in if you have anything to say. and I hope you'll join me for the next episode of the show when we will be discussing Cash Out. Until then, keep your eyes open.
This is